Okay, so good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Global Network webinars. This edition of the Global Network webinars we do jointly with the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys. So today we have with us Stephanie Eckman of the Social Data Science Center at the University of Maryland, who will present on the topic of science of data collection, insights from surveys that can improve machine learning models. My name is Alexander Loschke, and I will be moderating this webinar today together with my colleague Sean Lowe and Panya Yu. Let me give a short introduction to the topics. So, whether future AI models make the world safer or less safe for humans rests in part on our ability to efficiently collect accurate data from people about what they want the models to do. However, collecting high quality data is difficult, and most AI and machine learning researchers are not trained in data collection methods. The growing emphasis on data-centric AI highlights the potential of data to enhance model performance. It also reveals an opportunity to gain insights from survey methodology, the science of collecting high-quality survey data. This webinar will summarize lessons from the survey methodology literature and discuss how they can improve the quality of training and feedback data, which in turn improve model performance. Based on the cognitive response process model, our speaker Stephanie will formulate specific hypotheses about the aspects of label collection that may impact training data quality. She will also suggest collaborative research ideas into how possible biases in the data collection can be mitigated, making models more accurate and human-centric. Stephanie works at the Social Data Science Center of the University of Maryland as a principal research scientist specializing in research into data quality and data collection methods. She holds a PhD in survey methodology from the University of Maryland, and her research interests include sampling methods in challenging environments and the combination of survey and other forms of data. She has taught sampling and designed samples around the world. Just before I hand over to Stephanie, just three practical remarks. So we will first hear the presentation before we will have a Q&A session at the end. During the presentation, please feel free to write comments and questions into the meeting chat at any time. During the Q&A session, however, we encourage you to ask the questions yourself to create a more interactive atmosphere. For that, we will enable the microphones and also the video at that time. As always, we will record this session, this webinar, and we will make the recording available on the global network of data officers and statisticians at yammer.com/unstats. And before I hand over to Stephanie, actually, I will give also Howie the floor, who is representing the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys. Please go ahead, Howie.
Very quick. Thank you, Alex, Panya. Huge thanks to Stephanie. So my name is Howie Chan. I'm a coordinator for the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys. This is a group that consists of 11 international agencies and 10 member states. We work together to advance innovative survey methodologies, survey coordination, and communication, really be a platform to share knowledge and experience. That this is why we're here today. Really, really grateful to you, Stephanie, and to my colleagues who organized the webinar. And that'll be it. Thank you so much. Floor is yours, Stephanie.
Great.
Yes, Stephanie, please go ahead. Yes, thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the kind introduction and the invitation to speak with you all this morning. I'm going to share my screen here. Just bear with me for a moment. No. Okay, there we go. Hope you can see the slides now and the little pointer. I presume if not, Alex, that you'll let me know. So I'm going to talk today, as Alex suggested, about how the AI and machine learning communities can learn, what they can learn from us as survey data collectors. I think that we've got a lot of people doing data collection to train and refine the largest models, you know, these LLM models that we've constantly hearing about in the news. They're all trained on data that are collected from people using instruments that look a lot like surveys, but the people doing that data collection are not survey methodologists and don't know how to run high quality surveys. And so I worry that the data they're collecting is not quite appropriate. So that's sort of the talk in a nutshell. This is joint work that I've been doing for a few years now with Christoph Kern, Rob Chu, Jakob Beck, Bolema, and Frauke Kreuter. These folks are all at LMU University in Munich, except for Rob Chu, who is at RTI International. We've got a nice interdisciplinary international group working on this project. So some of you may know this guy. This is Sam Altman. He leads the OpenAI company that has created a lot of the largest, most popular models in the news media, the large language models. So like GPT-3, ChatGPT, the newest one was, I think, GPT-4o. You may have heard of some of these models or even used them yourselves. And so he on this popular podcast was saying that the bias that he's most nervous about when he's developing these models is the bias of the human feedback raters, the people who are creating the data that is used to train these models or refine them or make sure that they're aligned with our values as people, as humans. And so coming at this field from the survey perspective, I've spent more than 20 years collecting survey data all around the world, as I'm sure many of you do as well. When I look at the training data collected for these models, I also worry about the bias of the human feedback raters, right? We worry a lot about the quality of the data that we collect in surveys. And so I think there's good reason to worry about the quality of the data that they collect to drive these models as well. We know that when we're collecting survey data, we have to worry about incorrect answers. Are the respondents sort of clicking the wrong answer choice for some reason? Are they getting fatigued or bored as they do the surveys, right? And then, of course, in many countries, response rates have been falling over the last 20 years or so. So are we correctly representing the population with our surveys that we want to? So we worry about all these kinds of issues, and I think they have really clear parallels in the training data that, that folks in the AI and ML communities aren't fully appreciating and taking care of now. So I'm hoping with this work to speak to those folks and also to survey folks and say, hey, we got to work together. There's points of joint concern here. So I want to talk today about how we can help the machine learning field, improve the quality of their training data and thus improve the models themselves. So this is an instrument that OpenAI, the company run by Sam Altman on the previous slide, used to collect data to refine one of their models. There was the model called InstructGPT, maybe not one that you've heard of, but it's nicely documented. So I was able to grab this screenshot of what the data collection instrument looks like. A lot of times they don't report how they collect these data. So this is a rare find. So what do we see here? The model is so there's an article here in the big purple box, and the model summarizes that article in this little bluish box here. And what the rater or the annotator should do is read the article, read the summary, and then give some feedback about that summary. So the first thing they do is they rate the summary on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 is the worst and 7 is the best. And then they answer these questions about it. Fails to follow the correct instruction or task, yes, no. Inappropriate for customer assistant, yes, no. Contains sexual content, yes, no. So this is the instrument that OpenAI used to collect the data to refine the InstructGPT model, which means it had already been trained sort of on data scraped from the internet, but this was used to make sure that it was behaving sort of appropriately, right? No overly sexual content, no violent content, not hurting protected classes such as racial minorities. And so the rater would, read the article, read the summary, answer these questions, optionally enter some notes, and then submit. Oddly, the submit button is up in the upper left corner here. I think in surveys, we'd be more used to having that on the lower right corner. And then, as soon as they submit it, there's another one. And so this would just go on and on. Sometimes our surveys contain like 10 questions or 100 questions. They're a little bit different. And once you get done with those, you're done with the survey. But here, really, I think this goes on sort of as long as you want it to until you choose to stop, right? You can submit and then do another one. It looks very identical, slightly, different article and a different summary. But it just continues until the human feedback rater chooses to stop. And as I mentioned, OpenAI did a nice job documenting the training of this model, the InstructGPT model. And so they reported that the people who participated in this training task were 22% Filipino and 22% Bangladeshi. So 44% of their raters were from just those two countries. Oftentimes the companies don't report who their raters are, so this is rare information and I think really interesting and shows you, that this is done by a special group of people. We don't know how much they were paid or how well they were trained, or I don't have that information. Clearly, a sample that's 44% Filipino and Bangladeshi is not representative of like the world population, right? So there's a little bit of bias there. That's something I'll talk about in a bit. But my first insight when I saw this instrument in a paper is that this looks to me just like a web survey, right? We've got some information and we've got some questions and they should click these buttons and optionally put in some open text. So this was my first insight where I thought, oh, they're doing web surveys. They don't know enough about like how to do high quality web surveys the way that we do, but really what they're doing is something very much like a web survey. And that gave me the insight like, oh, I bet that we could help them, right? And we can help them collect better data. So I'm going to talk today about two types of concerns that we have with survey data. One of those is representation, and I hinted at this on the previous slide, right? So who are the people that are providing this data? Are they people living in the Philippines and in Bangladesh? Are they people living in the United States? What's their gender balance or racial balance? So that's the representation angle. Survey methodologists, survey data collectors, we worry a lot about representation. We've got a lot of thoughts there, right? The other part I'm going to talk about is measurement. Like, how do we know that the data we're collecting are the right answers to the questions, or the best answers to the questions that we can get? I'm going to talk about these two issues. I'm actually going to talk about them in the opposite order than I have them on the slide here. There are obviously other things we could talk about, other survey issues, such as like cost. How do we collect data at the least cost or sort of efficiently? And how do we collect data quickly enough, timeliness? I'm not going to talk about those issues. They're super important. I know a lot of you, or I believe a lot of you, come from like national statistical offices where maybe cost and timeliness are the most important concerns you're worried about. And I'm just not going to talk about those today. I only have as much time as I have, so I can't do everything. And so, as I said, I'm going to talk about these in opposite order. So let's talk first about measurement. How do we know that the labels we're collecting to train these models are the right labels? Well, when we think about response behavior in surveys, we can think about like the ideal response behavior, and then we can think about ways that it maybe doesn't go quite the way it should. So in an ideal world, this comes from the Taranjo et al. Model. There's several different versions of this. I've sort of just shortened it here to be like the smallest model that I could find. But the ideal response behavior, according to this Taranjo et al. Model, is first, the respondent in a survey should read the question and comprehend it. Like, they know what all the words mean, they can follow the sentence structure, right, and the response options. It all sort of makes sense to them. And then retrieval. If the question is asking about something in their memory, they have to go into their memory and count, like, how many times did I go to the doctor last year or something like this, right? So you have to go into your memory and retrieve information. Then you have to bring all that together. You've got the question, you've got this information retrieved, and you've got to bring those together and integrate those two pieces of information. And then map that onto the response choices in the mapping phase. And there might be a little bit of back and forth here, right? Oh, once you get to the mapping phase and you realize, oh, the answer choices aren't what I expected. I don't think I understood the question. I got to go back up and re-comprehend the question. Or I went to integrate these pieces of information and I realized that I need to do some more retrieval because something's not working here. This is the ideal response behavior that we hope that our survey respondents go through. Of course, they don't always. Sometimes we get less than ideal response behavior. There's several different forms that this can take. One is this satisficing. This work comes from John Krosnick's papers. Satisficing is the idea of picking like a good enough answer. So if it's a long list and maybe select all that apply, like you just select some of the ones that apply and you move on to the next question. Like that's good enough. I don't need to read all of these. Or maybe satisficing would be like, I usually pick the first response option because it's fine. And then acquiescence is a more extreme version of non-ideal response behavior. We just always say yes to yes/no questions. Other problems can come up, like maybe the questions aren't worded very well. So let's look again at that instrument from the Instruct GPT labeling. So we see here, first there's this rating question, right? Where's my cursor? There it is. So we're rating a question. We're rating that article summary from worst 1 to best 7. If we were in person in the same room, I would ask everyone to sort of contribute and say, well, what do you think in terms of like the ideal and less than ideal response behaviors? What do you see here? What are you worried about? Unfortunately, I don't think this is the right venue for that. And the way I have this set up right now, I can't actually see the Teams window at all. So I don't think there's an opportunity for interactive behavior here. But one of the things I worry about here is like, why are we having the respondents click a number? Like, why not just label these sort of as worst and best and have them click a 7-point scale there, right? It's pretty reasonable. If, a respondent might get these backwards. I think that 1 is the best and 7 is the worst. If they're hurrying, if they're not paying attention, if they've done like 100 of these, maybe they're getting fatigued and paying a little bit less attention. And then we've got these questions down here, which are all yes, no. And some of them have question marks where you can roll over and get additional information. I presume that's what that is. I don't have a live version of this instrument, but I presume that what this is you can hover over the question mark and you get more information, maybe about what the correct instruction or task is, or what a customer assistant does. The literature on that, on use of these kinds of definitions in surveys suggests that people do not use these definitions, even when they should, even when they know that they don't know what these terms mean. They're a little bit reluctant to use these kind of definitions when responding to surveys. So I would worry that they're also reluctant to use them when labeling, but I don't, we haven't done any data collection on that. Some of the wording on these questions is a bit odd. Fails to follow correct instruction, yes. It's a negatively worded question. I might reword that as like follows the correct instruction, yes, no, rather than fails to follow, where yes means that they didn't do something. I think that's a little bit cognitively odd. Denigrates a protected class. That's unusual language. I probably would rephrase that. Denigrated is a pretty advanced word, a high reading level. So I think there's some reasons to be concerned here about this instrument. If somebody sent me this as a survey reviewer, I would push back and say, you need to change these. So then that just leads me to worry, like there might be problems when we use these kind of instruments to collect labeled data. So we did a study to test some of these ideas. We had a bunch of tweets with 3,000 tweets, and we labeled each one as to whether it contained hate speech, yes, no, or offensive language, yes, no. So you can see these are meant to be labels here. for labeling each one as whether it contains hate speech or whether it contains offensive language. We took 3,000 tweets and we developed 5 versions of a data collection instrument. So in InstructGPT, we saw their instrument, and I thought, I bet there's some issues with how they've created this. We know in web surveys that small changes to the instrument can change the data that we collect, right? So we did 5 versions of the instrument to try to demonstrate that point. We collected 3 labels for each tweet in each condition, which led to us about 45,000 labels. So here are the 5 conditions that we used. And each of these boxes is a page, like a screen of the label collection instrument. So in condition A, the labelers saw the tweet, and then they saw 2 questions. Does this tweet contain hate speech? Yes, no. Does this tweet contain offensive language? Yes, no. Those were on the same screen. And then they went to tweet 2, and then tweet 3, and tweet 4, and so on. Then they did 50 tweets. Each annotator did 50 tweets. In condition B, they saw a tweet, and then they saw just, does this tweet contain hate speech? Yes, no. And then on the next screen, does this tweet contain hate speech? I'm sorry, does this tweet contain offensive language? Yes, no. So we're collecting the same amount of information as we are in condition A. We're just doing it over 2 screens. We separated the hate speech collection on a different screen from the offensive language condition. And then we move on to tweet 2. Is this hate speech? Yes, no. Is this offensive language? Yes, no. And again, up to all 50 tweets. Condition C is exactly the same as condition B, but we've flipped the order of the hate speech and offensive language. So we're first showing tweet 1 and getting the offensive language label, yes, no, and then the hate speech label, yes, no. And then in condition D, we first do all 50 tweets. Is this hate speech? Yes, no. Is this hate speech? Yes, no. Is this one hate speech? Yes, no. And then we do all 50 tweets again. Does this tweet contain offensive language? Yes, no. Does this tweet contain offensive language? Yes, no. So all 50 with the hate speech label, and then again, the same 50 with the offensive language label. And then just as above, condition E is just a flip of that, where we first collect all 50 tweets, whether they're offensive language, yes, no, and then all 50 tweets, whether they're hate speech, yes, no. So you can see we've got a nice pairing. B and C are just flips of each other, and D and E are just flips of each other. We did not flip condition A. In retrospect, we definitely should have, but we did not. So that would have been nice. So in this way, we collected 3 labels of each tweet in each condition. And then we took all those labels and split them into training sets and test sets. And actually, we did this at the tweet level. So if you think just about the hate speech labels, setting aside offensive language for right now, we took all of our tweets and split them into a training set and a test set. And then for each of the tweets in the training set, we have labels collected in condition A, collected in condition B, C, D, and E. And then for the tweets in the test set, we also have 5 versions of the test data. We have the labels collected on those tweets using condition A's instrument, using the condition B instrument, and so on. Then we trained models on each of these 5 sets of the training data. And the models that we trained were BERT models. If you're familiar with different types of language models, these were BERT models, which were sort of state of the art several years ago. They're not the big LLMs that you hear about these days. So we trained a model using only the labels from condition A, and then another model using only the labels from condition B, and so on. And then we can test those models against the different types of test data. And then we did the whole thing also for offensive language. I don't have a graphic about that, but we trained models in exactly the same way for the offensive language labels. The goal here of the models is to try to predict, if I give it a tweet, it'll output, is this hate speech? Is this offensive language, right? That's what the models are going to predict. You can imagine that this would be helpful, if you're running a social media site and you want to flag offensive content, that's why you might need these models. So I'm going to show you 4 sets of results here. I'm going to look at how the labels differ in each condition. how the models differ in the conditions, and then how the model predictions differ. And then I'm going to look at some preliminary evidence on order effects. So here are the labels for the offensive language, for the collection of offensive language. These orange and blue boxes over here in this column, they're just trying to remind you of what the conditions were. So in A, on one screen, we first collected hate speech and then offensive language. In B, we collected hate speech on a screen and then offensive language on a screen, and then hate speech and then offensive language. And then down here, we've got the ones where we do all 50 hate speech and then all 50 offensive language and the reverse. And what we see here is that the percent of tweets, now the tweets are exactly the same in each condition. It's the same 3,000 tweets. So there shouldn't be any differences in the conditions if the instrument doesn't matter. If these different patterns in how we collect the labels don't matter, then we should see that all these bars are the same length. We get the same percent of tweets flagged offensive language. That isn't what we see. Condition A has the lowest amount of tweets found to be offensive language. B and C work really similar, and then D and E do not. So in D, we have a lower rate of offensive language labeling than we do in condition E. And these differences that I'm mentioning are significant. So D has significantly fewer tweets labeled offensive language than E, and A is lower as well than the others. And then when we go to hate speech, we can see that first of all, fewer of the tweets are hate speech, which makes sense. Hate speech is a more sort of extreme label. Again, we see that in A, hate speech is lowest, condition A, and then we see the opposite effect in D and E, right? So there's more hate speech labels in condition D and fewer hate speech labels in condition E. I'll talk more about the difference between these this D and E conditions in a bit. But you can see that B and C, smaller differences here, not too much going on. These two seem to be operating in the same way. And then when we think about the models themselves, I'm going to show you some models where with the balanced accuracy score, this graphic is going to show you the balanced accuracy scores, which is just a measure of model performance, like how good the models are, how well they fit. The graph is a little bit complicated, so I'm showing it here without any of the numbers filled in, so I can first just explain how it works. Again, we've got these orange and blue squares to kind of try to remind you what the conditions are. On the vertical axis, this tells you what condition a model was trained in. So again, we've got these different train and test sets for each condition. So here in this row, we're going to see the performance of models trained on the labels collected in condition A, the performance of the models trained on data collected in condition B, and so on, right? And then the other part of the graph, the columns are showing us what data the models were tested on. So again, we've got these 5 test sets, and we can test our model using using labels collected in condition A, using labels collected in condition B, C, and so on. So on the main diagonal here, we're going to have models trained in condition A and tested on data collected in condition A, and then BB, CC, DD, EE. And now I'll fill it in here. So I'm showing you the balanced accuracy metrics, but I'm also, the colors just give you a sort of hint of what's going on, right? So the darker the color, the higher the balanced accuracy, the better the model is working. We don't see an effect of a main diagonal, right? I would have thought that we'd see a nice dark blue streak on the main diagonal. That isn't what we see. Instead, we see these really stark row and column effects. So condition A is not doing very well. It doesn't work well as a training set. These are all low accuracy numbers, and it also doesn't work well as a test set. These are all among the lowest accuracy numbers as well. Similarly, condition E isn't doing very well as a test or a train set either. Condition E is the one where you first label all 50 tweets as hate speech, and then you see the same 50 tweets again as offensive language. And so then we see that that condition isn't doing very well in terms of balanced accuracy. E in contrast, is doing a lot better. We've got nice dark blue values here in the column and the row associated with condition E, suggesting that E is doing a lot better than D. And again, E is where we first collected all the offensive language labels and then the hate speech labels. So strong row and column patterns here in the offensive language model. If we look at the same graph for the hate speech model, we see very different patterns. So here, condition A is doing a bit better, especially as a test set. We've got some nice dark orange colors here in the column associated with A as a test set. And we've got a nice dark row here associated with column D as a training set. And so I think what we're starting to see with these results and the previous ones with the bars showing the offensive language and the hate speech is that in condition E, we're getting higher quality labels for hate speech because hate speech comes first, right? We first collect all 50 labels of hate speech, yes, no, on all the tweets in condition E. And so the hate speech labels are good quality. But then when the labelers come along and say and have to see all 50 tweets again and code them as offensive language, they don't do as well. And that's why we have these light rows for the offensive language model. So because the hate speech is first in condition E, we're getting higher quality data there. And because offensive language is second, we're getting lower quality data. That's my hypothesis. We haven't conclusively shown that. And then the converse in condition E, where we're getting higher quality offensive language data labels because those come first, and lower quality hate speech labels. I'm sorry, one moment. Excuse me, just need a little Kleenex. So this to me suggests that there's a fatigue effect going on, that when the same tweets start coming back at the end of the condition, at the end of the data collection in conditions D and condition E, the labelers are not doing their best. And condition A, as I said, also isn't doing very well, specifically in offensive language, where offensive language was the second label collected. And then if we can look at the predictions of the model, again, here I've covered up the data just so we can think about what the table is going to look like before I show you what the numbers are. So we're looking at the agreement, the Krippendorf's alpha agreement between the predictions of the model. So we've done from each model, from models trained on labels in condition A, we've predicted all of the, for each tweet then in the test set, we've predicted whether it's going to be whether it's hate speech or offensive language. So we take our model trained in condition A and we predict those hate speech and offensive language labels. And then we compare the predictions from each model to the other models. And so this is going to be a matrix of Krippendorf alpha's agreement statistics. And we see that, again, condition A is underperforming. It's not doing as well. So it's got among the lowest alpha scores here, both for offensive language and for hate speech. Again, condition A is the one where we collected both labels on one screen. This is, we believe, quite common in the when doing label collection, like you show a prompt and then you collect all of the information about that prompt that you want. That's what we saw in the InstructGPT instrument, right? They had one summary and then they had several questions about it. What this research suggests is it's probably better to split those collections into multiple screens. So rather than collecting them like this, first collect hate speech and then collect offensive language and so on, like conditions B and C. We also have some evidence of order effects. So we randomly ordered the tweets that annotators saw from 1 to 50. So as an annotator, you're going to see 50 tweets, and we randomly ordered them. And we see that the percent of tweets labeled as hate speech and offensive language declines slightly across those 50 tweets. If we look at that by condition, again, we see decreasing slopes on these lines, right? So tweets that come 50th are less likely to be labeled as both hate speech and offensive language than those that come earlier in the batch of tweets that people label. These results, they're not significant in each of the conditions, I believe. And we didn't fully randomize this, so we couldn't test too many hypotheses about why this is going on. But I think this is a really intriguing effect that warrants more investigation. So from the measurement side, our takeaways are that how you collect these annotations matters. Now, that's probably not so much of a surprise to those of you who are survey data collectors, because we know that these kinds of manipulations have impacts on web surveys, but nobody's ever shown, to my knowledge, that this also happens in label collection. So that's what we've done with this talk here. That the annotations, the way you collect the annotations, the instrument affects the labels that you get. But I think more importantly, we've also shown with those complex agreement matrices, the orange and blue matrices that I showed you with different light and dark colors, and with the prediction correlations, that not only the labels are impacted, but the models are impacted. You actually get different models and better and worse performance with these different conditions. And that's the point I really want to bring over to the AI and ML folks, to say, hey, these problems matter and you need to pay more attention to them. Okay, so moving to the representation side here, and now we haven't done a study here. We're planning some studies here, so I'm going to talk about some work that is more sort of theoretical, and then work that is not our own, but I also think is very interesting. So when we think about non-response bias in surveys, and I'm sure those of you who are survey data collectors spend a lot of your time worrying about non-response bias and following response rates. Bias arises in survey data. What does it mean for bias to arrive? It means that the mean that we get from a survey, this little y bar, the survey mean among our respondents, is a biased estimate of the thing we're really interested in, which is the mean among the population, which is capital Y bar. This notation may not be familiar to many of you, but this is what I'm used to. So little y bar, the survey estimate is a biased estimate of the population mean. And that arises when we have a correlation between the propensity to participate in a survey, the propensity to take part in a survey, and the propensity to, and the actual, I'm fumbling because I should have changed this graphic and made it more survey specific. The version I have here is a labeling version, and I should have made a survey version first. But non-response bias arises in surveys when the propensity to take part in a survey is correlated with the thing we're measuring. So the example I just was writing about in a recent paper is like, say we want to measure whether somebody has health insurance. If we were to go to doctors' offices and hand out like paper surveys or maybe links to web surveys and ask, hey, we're interested in doing a health survey, please take our survey, right? That's going to be a biased survey because the people who are at the doctor's office are probably more likely to have health insurance. If you don't have health insurance, you don't go to the doctor very often, right? So the people in the waiting room at a doctor's office are overrepresent the population that has health insurance and underrepresent the population that doesn't have health insurance. And so that's a situation in which the likelihood to participate, to receive the invitation to take the web survey is correlated with the thing we're measuring, health insurance. And so that's a bad idea. And those of you who are survey data collectors know this very well. So I'm trying to set the stage that the correlation between these two items, the propensity to take the survey and the thing we're measuring, is what introduces bias in surveys, and that we see the same thing when we label. Potentially, we could see the same thing when we're labeling. So if the propensity to participate in labeling, to engage in a labeling task, is correlated with the propensity to assign a given label, then again, the labels that we collect are going to be sort of a biased representation of the population's feeling about something. So if we happen to collect a bunch of labelers, happen to recruit labelers who are very jaded and don't think anything is offensive, right? They have a very high threshold for offensiveness. Nothing offends them. If those are the people who are labeling for our task, then our model, then we're going to collect a bunch of labels where offensive language is no, and that's not going to represent the population. There's a propensity then to participate in labeling that's correlated with the propensity to assign a given label. Another example I was just playing with here is, imagine if you're a biker. I'm a biker, right? So you're a biker in your city and you're frustrated that people are constantly parking in the bike lane. And that gets you fired up, and that causes you to want to label a data set about bike lane violations. I once labeled a data set of bike lane violations, like pictures from cameras. Are there blockers in the bike lane in these pictures? Yes or no, right? The fact that I'm a biker causes me to want to do that labeling. And it also causes me to be pretty strict and see a lot of violations. Whereas somebody who's not a biker maybe doesn't want to participate in that labeling task, doesn't think it's important, and also doesn't see a lot of bike lane violations, right? So we get a correlation between these two propensities, which means that the labels we collect for the bicycle lane violation data set don't represent what most people would think are bicycle lane violations. Now, does that matter? In a survey, we're really, we're ultimately trying to estimate this population Y bar. In a labeling task, we're not necessarily trying to represent like what percent of the population thinks this is a cat versus a dog, or thinks that this car is parked too much in the bike lane, right? However, we do want the models trained on the data to represent the values of the population. And so I think it does matter, or it can matter in some cases. So let's think about this a little bit more. Here again is that InstructGPT instrument, and we see the questions that are asked about fails to follow the correct instruction or task, right? Labeler characteristics, the kind of person that you are going to influence the answers that you give here, right? Maybe women are more likely to see sexual content. Maybe people who are members of a protected class are more likely to see something that denigrates a protected class. People differ in their moral judgment, so they're going to assign different labels here. Maybe religious people have different value, different thoughts on this question than non-religious people. So the characteristics of the labelers are going to impact the values that they give here. And then there's really interesting data showing that the labelers' characteristics also impact the models that are trained on those data. So this is a rather complex example. I think I'll move on to the next example that makes this a little bit more easily. So this is a really nice website from some researchers in Cyprus, showing that the labelers that you have on your task influences the labels that you collect and also the models that you train on those data. So let me pull up this tool. Here it is. So we can change this image. Let's see, is this one here? I was just looking at this one before the talk. And they've labeled this person's gender, race, attractiveness, and trustworthiness. Let's look at race. And if we execute here, we can see what the different sets of labelers said here. So if we look at all annotators, the majority label was Latino. But if we look just at Asian labelers, they believe that on balance that this guy was Asian. And Black annotators as well also thought that he was Asian. If we look at trustworthiness, we again see that the labelers differ in how trustworthy they find this guy. The Asian labelers found him to be very high trustworthiness, whereas women found him to be low trustworthiness. And so here's a really nice example showing the labeler characteristics impacts the labels that you get. And so that's why it's important that we get the balance right on our labelers, right? If we're trying to collect labels to train a model that is going to be used around the world, we have to make sure that the labelers that we get are somewhat representative of that population as well. I'm gonna go back to my slides. That's a really fun tool. You might want to play around with it. So the link is here if you like. So what can we do about selection bias? Again, here's the graph showing that labeler characteristics influence the propensity to participate in labeling and the propensity to assign a given label, which makes this correlation, which is what causes selection bias. There are a couple different things that we can do here. On the left side of the diagram, we can try to break this correlation. If we can remove the impact of labeler characteristics on the propensity to participate in labeling, then we get rid of the correlation that's causing the problems. We can do that by diversifying the labor pool. So if we had like random selection into the labeling task, that would be one way we could break that portion of the diagram. That's what we try to do in surveys, right? Is to collect a representative sample of respondents. It's really hard to do that in surveys. It's also hard to do that in labeling tasks. We can try to break the correlation on the right side of the diagram by removing the influence of label characteristics on the propensity to assign a given label. We can train the labelers to sort of label objectively or uniformly. This is the approach that's used in like qualitative coding research, where they try to train their coders to all give the same kind of label, to agree on how the labeling should be done. That may work. It's difficult and expensive and time consuming. So probably not going to scale for the kind of labels that we need for the large models that we're developing these days. A third approach that we're currently investigating with our research group is to use statistical weights in model training to adjust the population of labelers to match the relevant population. So we take those InstructGPT labels that were like 22% Bangladeshi, 22% Filipino, obviously not representative of like the world population, right? But if we could reweight those and train the model on reweighted data, maybe we'd get better representation and better performing models. So I think there's a lot of work to do to make the AI and ML communities aware of selection bias. We got to test these hypotheses about when selection bias matters and what motivates people to participate in labeling tasks. And we have to figure out how to use weights in training. I think that's an open question. Some of the folks in the research group are figuring that out, but that's not something that I think that's in the literature. We also, in the paper that I'm working on right now, we argue that we need transparency. We need better understanding of how these labels are currently collected. As I said, that InstructGPT screenshot that I showed you is one of the few that talks about how the labels are collected. We need more of that sort of transparency so that we can do the research that I think needs to be done, right, on order effects and selection bias. If we don't have any of that documented, you can't do the research. So I just wanted to end with this quote from a recent paper. I believe this was some folks at Google, and they were lamenting that among the AI community, everybody wants to do the model work, not the data work. Everybody wants to like go to GitHub and download the newest, greatest model and mess around with the parameters and get the performance up a little bit compared to others, right? That's where like the excitement is, and that's how you make a name for yourself in the AI and ML field. It's not in doing the data work. But luckily, there's folks like me and like many of you who specialize in doing the data work. And so I want to make the point to that community, hey, there's a bunch of us who do know how to do the data work and can help you. So thank you very much. And here are some recent papers from the group that I mentioned, the group out of LMU and RTI and me. This first one is the one I'm working on now, and then these two are the findings that I discussed briefly. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. This is really amazing. Your talk, a lot of great information in there about, yeah, the bias that is possible in the creation and training of those models. I have now opened up the microphones and the cameras, and I would like to open up the floor now for questions. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand or write it into the meeting chat. But I think it's nicer if you just raise your hand and ask the question yourself. And yeah, anyone wants to break the ice? I see Hossein has the hand up. Hossein, maybe you want to go first? And then I see Habib.
I hope that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Well, first of all, congratulations, Stephanie, for the great work that you are doing. And just to break ice and start on the question. So if I may ask a couple of questions, perhaps here. So your approach is a binary approach, and we know that a couple of bias coming to that area because we have a threshold to make it as a 0 and 1. Have you considered like a sentiment analysis? Because this is an area I'm working particularly for the Twitter or X tweet that we have as a sentiment rather than looking at it as a binary approach. That's help a lot in order to achieve one of the goals that you have, particularly for ML. That's help a lot for training and the test. That's one I wanted to perhaps you kindly elaborate on that further for the audience, perhaps quite would be useful. One thing that I would like to mention as a statistician, I have point for clarification. I think you mean the Y small bar, I wrote it to Alex as well, is an estimate for Y bar, but not for the population for mu, you mean. So the mu is a population, Y bar random variable, Y small bar is what you observed. I think that's what you mean by one of your slides, just for clarification.
Yeah. So to take your first question about the binary data, I believe that in this analysis here, we're looking at the correlation between the predicted probabilities, not between the 0 ones. You're right that like hate speech and offensive language is not a binary yes, no, like there isn't like a true value about whether this is hate speech or whether this is offensive language. I think the true value is like this one, 80% of the population thinks this is offensive, sure, and 30% thinks this is hate speech. So I totally agree with your point. The literature, however, on offensive language and hate speech detection is looking for that 0-1 label, right? Like, is this hate speech? Should we delete this from the platform, or is it not? And we should leave it on the platform. So a little bit we're, trying to speak to that literature, which is why we think about it as a binary. But I believe the propensities here, or the predictions, the Krippendorf's alpha here, are the agreement between the predicted probabilities and not between the zeros and the ones. But you'd have to look at the paper to be sure about that. I don't remember it 100%. To your second question, yes, there can be a difference between like the finite population and the superpopulation mean. I didn't want to get into that in this presentation.
Sure. And thank you again, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Hossein works for the Comprehensive Test Ban Organization, Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. Sorry, just wanted to follow up on that. Then we have Habib and then Haoi. Maybe we can go in this order. Habib is a colleague here from UNSD, from the UN Statistics Division. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you so much for the presentation. It's actually really interesting work, and I would like to congratulate you on this work. So what I was thinking while I was listening to you is that the AI people, the Sam Altman and the likes, my fear is that they already know these things. I mean, they know, maybe they don't understand the problem of representation of bias very well, but they're at least aware of it, right? So they know they're making these mistakes, but they still, what I think is that they prioritized cost and speed over accuracy, right? Because I was listening to this guy, I keep forgetting his name. He's called the father of AI, and he was describing the early days of AI, right? And right, so you remember his name, and he was describing like a time where they had to choose between going in. They had this basically two paths to pursue. One was the more, they could make AI more intuitive, or they could make it more mathematical, and they chose the more intuitive path because that's what gives them fast models, right? So they are they are taking these risks, being somewhat aware of it, right? So what I was thinking is that, of course, they can use our expertise, but what I'm more concerned with is how can we use what they have, right? So more and more people are talking about specialized AI models, right? Because you see all these generic large language model AI models, lots of companies, there is like a pattern, big companies, they roll out an AI something product, and then after a few weeks they roll it back because something goes wrong, something goes like, it looks like it's performing well, but it makes a serious mistake, they have to roll it back. So lots of people are talking about a specialized AI model, which is specific to a particular context for a particular use, and which has been trained very well with high quality data and by experts in the field already, what I would like to see is us, so the community of official statisticians, we use AI in this kind of very specialized setting. I was just wanted to hear whether you have any thoughts there. And then the second question I have is that the very interesting point you raised about the fatigue bias, right? This bias, I think, would affect us equally as well, no, if not more, because when we because our surveys are longer, right? It's more complex, right? So question is, how do we account for that? So two questions basically: how do we use AI given our expertise in different fields? And second, how do we deal with the fatigue bias? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, to the first question, I think we as a community need to go to the conferences and talk to the AI folks and demonstrate that like we have expertise that we can bring to them to help them improve their models. I think you're right that sometimes they release models and then like, oh wait, that didn't work, and then they walk it back. And collecting better training data in the first place can perhaps reduce those occurrences and reduce the embarrassment. So maybe we can capitalize on those kind of situations to say, you know, we can help you collect better data and do better in the future. About the fatigue effects, I think you're absolutely right. These do happen in surveys. What can we do about it? I mean, one approach that isn't ideal is to change the order of the questions. So that if the fatigue is going to happen, you know, towards the end of a survey, then don't always have like the income questions at the end, because that's where people are going to be dropping out or giving low quality data because they're tired. You can put those for some people at the beginning of the survey, or you can just make the surveys. One of the ideas I've heard people saying is making the surveys shorter and then randomizing, right? So like a quarter of the people get this version of a short survey, and then another quarter get this version of a short survey, and then imputing what's missing, right? I think it's called matrix factorization survey, something like this. Both of those are non-ideal solutions, right? Because every time you're imputing data, you worry about the error there. If we start changing the order of questions for each respondent, then we have to worry about the order effects being different across respondents, and I think that's a real problem. So yeah, I worry a lot about fatigue effects in surveys, and that's why I'm constantly telling people to make their surveys shorter. But they often don't.
Thank you. Let's go to Howie, please. What's your question?
First of all, Stephanie, has anyone told you that you're such a great person in presenting the idea? I struggle a lot with the biases, explaining the propensity whenever I had to. Really clear, super interesting. So my question is, Falcon and I discussed a little bit, we are sitting as survey methodologists, we're sitting a pool of data from surveys. Could these be used to help with the AI world, people who are building models? Those are really data collected from people, just the existing survey, microdata. They're possible to use this because these are really, you know, talking to people is still very important nowadays.
Right. No, I think that's an interesting idea. We do have like, you know, survey from opinion, like the barometer surveys or the world value surveys, right? We have international data sets where people are answering a standardized set of questions with their characteristics, right? So we can teach models, well, in this country, men tend to believe hold these kinds of opinions, and women tend to hold these sorts of opinions. And it's representative data, because we worry a lot about that kind of thing. And we hope that it's high quality data because we worry about how to word questions and make the instrument easy to follow. So I think that is very promising. I have seen one paper that was recently trained on like the general social survey, trying to teach a model what Americans think using one of our leading opinion surveys. But I haven't seen too much of that. So I think that's a great idea for future exploration.
Yeah, thank you. I also see the hand up by Karabo. Karabo, I believe, works for the Central Bank of Botswana. Karabo, please go ahead. Bravo?
We can't hear you.
No, you have your microphone off. Now it's
Hello.
audible.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi. I was having trouble unmuting my mic. Sorry. I hope that
Okay.
I'm audible.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
I have just one question. For the smaller surveys where, large language models and GPTs might not be in use, on certain economic variables where we face challenges on data collection that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. My question is, for machine learning models, do we then consider resampling methodologies where we bring in concepts of validation sets or k-fold cross-validation, or maybe leave one out, cross-validations? And then if we use such resampling methods, the follow-up question would then be, does it negatively affect model predictions, given that when using resampling methodologies, we are kind of, in a way, recycling the given responses in a way, given that we have limited data?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I don't know enough about the resampling methodologies. Other members of the team are the ones who are fitting the models and could probably speak to that. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you. We are already a little bit over time, but maybe Stephanie, if you have like 2-3 more minutes, that would be great. So we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions more. I would maybe have one question is, so those large language models that we see lately popping up, and like ChatGPT or Claude or others, do we know on what data they have been trained? I mean, I was playing around with it, and of course you can tell ChatGPT to write a text in Spanish, or you can tell it to write a text in German or other languages. But of course, I would imagine that those models are not trained on all languages equally, and not all and that also the cultural bias plays an influence there. Can you maybe comment a little bit about that and what that probably means and how we can maybe resolve this?
Well, I'm not sure if I know how to resolve it, but I do think that's a real concern, right? So the models, the companies developing the models are largely American companies. So these big models that you mentioned, Claude and the ChatGPT versions. Mistral out of Paris is another model, but that's again a westernized, industrialized country. So it's these people who are often setting the standards for the kind of models that we're going to build and how to get the training data. But then the people actually generating the training data tend to be like low paid workers in developing countries, right? So we saw like Philippines, Bangladesh. And I worry a lot about that power imbalance, right? So the instructions are coming from these rich industrialized countries, and the people collecting the data are not members of those rich industrialized countries. And then the models are being used again then by a lot of people like me and office workers in the United States and in Europe. So I think there are big cultural problems there that get to that representation angle that I was talking about. So who are the labelers? What are their motivations? And what kind of labels do they assign? And then, those people, then the labelers then get in trouble if they don't correctly assign labels, right? If you make too many mistakes on what they call the test observations, then, you're not allowed to label anymore because you're not considered good enough. But maybe you're giving your own opinions, right? You're just not giving the opinions that this company headquartered in California is looking for. So there's a really great paper called Discipline and Label that goes into these kinds of details. I believe the first author is named Smart. That I would recommend to think about these issues. That's great. And they really make the point that like it's the global north that's dictating what the models are and are going to do. And it's the global south that are doing the underpaid work to drive the models. And there's a disparity there, which echoes the disparities we see in other situations as well.
All right. Thanks so much, Stephanie. Also, thank you for this answer, and especially thank you for presenting today.
Sure.
So maybe before we go, I could ask everyone if you can please put your camera on just for a few seconds. Maybe also switch on your microphones. That would be great. And then we can maybe give Stephanie a big round of applause. That's okay. Please join me. Thank you.
Thank
Lovely
you,
to see
Stephanie.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Great to see you. This is great. I like it.
Okay, is it going home?
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for this great presentation. We will share the recording and the slides, the presentation slides after this on the global network of data officers and statisticians. Please join there. The link was in the chat, yammer.com/UNstats. And please join us for our next global network webinar in June. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Hey.